Okay, let's unpack this. We have a story here. It sounds almost like military folklore, right? A story so specific, so bizarre, that it really cuts right to the heart of the Eastern Front's, well, its ultimate absurdity.
It really does.
The year is 1944. The German Wehrmacht is desperate. They're clinging to broken supply lines. They're constantly retreating. And our sources describe this specific group of highly skilled German mechanics.
Top guys, yeah.
And they spent weeks successfully rebuilding one of the most feared armored vehicles in the world,
Yeah.
formidable captured Soviet T-34 tank.
And here's the twist, the really profound, almost unbelievable part of the story. Instead of handing that operational, powerful machine over to a fighting unit, to try and help stabilize the collapsing Eastern Front.
You'd expect?
Right. These technicians allegedly wanted to surrender in it. They didn't see a war trophy. They saw an escape route.
It seems completely counterintuitive, doesn't it? Why put all that effort, all that highly valued, frankly, irreplaceable skilled labor into restoring a war machine just to, well, drive it straight in enemy lines and hand it over? Isn't captured equipment supposed to be a morale booster, a symbol of victory?
Well, fundamentally, this isn't just a tank story.
Yeah.
And it's certainly not about following military manuals or procedures. It's a really powerful narrative about the collision between, let's say, ideology and the cold, hard reality of physics and logistics on the battlefield.
Okay.
We're talking about highly trained individuals here, people who had privileged, really intimate knowledge of which side truly had the industrial and, frankly, the technical advantage at that point.
They saw it firsthand working on the machines.
Exactly. So this story, it's about superior enemy engineering, yes, but also about the grim late-war necessity of just plain survival. And it's about the logistical nightmare of fighting a technologically advanced war with equipment you simply cannot maintain anymore.
So, our mission today is pretty clear then. We're diving deep into the sources to understand really 3 interconnected areas. First, we need to examine the T-34's truly revolutionary design, how its debut just instantly shattered the German Army's supreme confidence back in 1941.
That initial shock was immense.
Second, we'll dissect the brutal logistical nightmare of actually trying to sustain those captured T-34s. We need to show why owning them quickly turned into a massive liability.
Possession versus reality, yeah.
And finally, we'll explore the shifting psychological landscape and the technical realism that drove late-war German soldiers toward this desperate, calculated logic of surrendering in the very machine they'd just fixed.
That calculation is key.
Okay, let's start the clock. Let's go back to the summer of 1941, a time when Germany believed its confidence was, well, unstoppable.
Right. To really appreciate the shock, you absolutely have to establish that context of confidence first. Operation Barbarossa launches June 22nd, 1941. At that specific moment, the German forces, the Wehrmacht, they had every logical reason to be supremely confident. I mean, they'd perfected Blitzkrieg, this rapid, mechanized warfare.
Rolled over everyone.
Exactly. Crushed Poland in weeks, swept through the Low Countries, conquered France in, 6 weeks? It was stunning.
They genuinely believed their panzer divisions were the absolute apex of military technology and armored doctrine at that time. They'd successfully navigated swamps, forests, everything across Western Europe.
And they fully expected the Soviet Union, which you have to remember they viewed through this intensely ideological lens as primitive, backward, disorganized. They expected it to just collapse. Just as quickly, maybe even before winter set in.
That was the plan, wasn't it? A short war?
That overconfidence was massive. And it was the perfect setup, really, for the massive shock that followed. They basically walked into Russia expecting a short, glorious, almost mechanized picnic.
Believing their own engineering was superior, their crews better trained.
And that the Soviet military was just inherently chaotic.
Yeah. And that whole worldview, that technological superiority, it just evaporated. Almost instantly. The sources point to a really specific date we need to focus on. June 23rd, 1941.
Day 2.
Literally the second day of the invasion. That's when the first serious encounters happened, and German tank commanders realized they were facing something they just hadn't accounted for at all. Their entire concept of tank warfare basically imploded right there.
The anecdotes from that day, they're really chilling. They speak directly to the psychological blow. The sources detail the experience of a Lieutenant Stupp, part of the German 4th Panzer Division.
Okay, what did he see?
He described engaging a T-34. And he brought his tanks, his panzers, within what they considered point-blank range, like 20 meters, then 50 meters, firing their absolute best armor-piercing rounds.
And these were the same rounds, the same guns, that had sliced through French Char B1s, British Matildas, everything they'd faced in France just a year earlier.
Absolutely. The 37 millimeter, the early 50 millimeter guns on the Panzer IIIs and IVs. Weapons they trusted completely.
And the result against the T-34.
Terrifying for the German crews. The shells literally just bounced off. Stoop's crew, and many others, reported having absolutely no effect whatsoever on this Soviet machine.
Wow. Just ricocheting.
Yeah. German soldiers, totally demoralized by this invulnerability, started describing the T-34 as an impregnable, prehistoric monster.
Prehistoric monster. That phrase really captures it, doesn't it? It's not just that the enemy weapon was effective, it's the catastrophic failure of their own best technology against an enemy they'd fundamentally dismissed as, well, primitive.
Imagine the terror. You're facing an opponent you literally cannot destroy, even when you've got them dead to rights at spitting distance. That was the moment right there. The myth of German armored supremacy just died on the vine.
A brutal awakening.
Immediate. And the reason for this sudden, shocking invincibility, it lies squarely in the T-34's truly revolutionary design. It achieved something pretty much unprecedented in 1941. It successfully balanced those three critical elements of tank warfare protection, firepower, and mobility.
The holy trinity of tank design.
Right. And crucially, in a way that was simple enough to mass-produce effectively.
Okay, let's focus on that protection element first, because that's what seemed to shatter German confidence initially. You mentioned it wasn't about just using impossibly thick steel plates, right? It was smarter than that.
It was pure genius in geometry. The sloped armor.
Ah, the famous sloped armor. Explain that.
Precisely. German tanks at the time, they typically relied on thick, but mostly flat, vertical plates. So a projectile hits the armor at close to a 90-degree angle, right? Maximizing the penetration force.
Makes sense. Straight on.
The T-34 designers, however, angled the frontal armor and parts of the side armor, too, at a really sharp 60 degrees. This wasn't just a minor tweak. It was applied physics that German designers had basically overlooked or maybe even dismissed.
So if you're German shell hitting that 60-degree slope, what happens? Why does the T-34's armor, which I understand wasn't necessarily that much thicker on paper than, say, a Panzer V's, why did it perform so much better?
Two really crucial things happened because of that angle. First, the shell has to cut through a much greater effective thickness of steel. Think about it like trying to cut a board straight down versus cutting it diagonally across its longest dimension.
The path is much longer through the material.
Exactly. So a 45-millimeter plate angled at 60 degrees gives you the protection equivalence of a plate nearly twice as thick, maybe around 90 millimeters. But critically, without the huge weight penalty that would come with just bolting on thicker steel.
Okay, so better effective thickness without the weight. What's the second point? You mentioned deflection.
Correct. That steep angle dramatically increases the likelihood that the incoming projectile will simply ricochet, just glance off entirely, rather than digging in and penetrating.
Like skipping a stone on water.
Sort of, yeah. And furthermore, even when the shell does strike at that angle and doesn't fully ricochet, it creates what's called a normalizing effect, which forces the projectile to sort of shear or yaw, dissipating its kinetic energy along the surface rather than focusing it inward for penetration.
Clever. Very clever.
It meant that T-34 achieved superior protection without becoming this impossibly heavy behemoth, which was kind of the direction the Germans eventually went later with a massive Tiger tank. That was their solution. Just add more and more steel.
Right. Brute force versus smart design. And that reduced weight from the sloped armor, it must have fed directly into the T-34's other big advantage. Its superior mobility, especially in the Russian terrain.
Mobility was absolutely crucial. The German Panzers, often designed with the better roads and infrastructure of Western Europe in mind, they struggled mightily in the infamous Russian mud, the Rasputitsa.
The mud season, yeah.
And the deep snows of winter, too. Their track widths were just insufficient for that soft, boggy terrain. They'd get completely stuck.
While the T-34.
The T-34, however, used these distinctive wide tracks. They distributed the tank's weight much more effectively over a larger area. This gave it superior cross-country mobility and maneuverability. It could literally traverse muddy fields or snow-covered ground that completely immobilized the narrower track German panzers.
So they were protected against German fire. They could move where German tanks got bogged down. And then there was the final piece of the puzzle, firepower. The T-34 wasn't just tough and mobile, it packed a punch.
A serious punch. It was armed with a powerful 76.2 millimeter high-velocity gun, and that gun was devastatingly decisive in 1941.
How did it compare to what the Germans had?
It could reliably destroy any German tank on the battlefield at that time, including the early models of the Panzer IV, which was supposed to be their main battle tank at ranges, where the German guns were not only ineffective against the T-34's sloped armor,
Because of the bouncing shells.
right, but often the German guns couldn't even scratch the T-34's paint at those ranges. So you have this combination, it's unstoppable, it's highly mobile, and it's lethal at ranges where you can't fight back. That's what created this overwhelming feeling of tank terror, as the Germans called it, among their forces. They realized their primary anti-tank weapons were basically useless.
That technical reality, it must have filtered up the chain of command pretty quickly, leading to, as you said, this major strategic admission of defeat for the Wehrmacht, at least in terms of tank design.
Oh, very quickly. By October 1941, so just a few months into the invasion, the German High Command realized they were fighting the wrong war with the wrong equipment. The sources confirmed this urgency.
And Guderian was key here.
General Heinz Guderian, yeah. One of the architects of Blitzkrieg, Germany's most celebrated tank commander. He saw the evidence firsthand on the front lines. He demanded a complete, immediate rethinking of German tank design. He'd simply watched too many of his best panzer units burn or get stuck in the mud, while these T-34s just shrugged off hits and kept rolling forward.
The psychological damage must have been immense, because it wasn't just losing battles, it validated what the frontline soldiers were already seeing. The enemy's technology, which was supposed to be primitive according to propaganda, was actually fundamentally better designed for the environment they were fighting in.
Exactly. But the problem wasn't just the quality of the T-34. It was also the quantity.
Ah, the industrial shock.
And this is what truly defined the war on the Eastern Front, arguably. When the invasion started, the Soviets already had almost 1,000 P-34s deployed. Now, yes, they suffered absolute massive losses in the initial chaos of Barbarossa, maybe 2,300 T-34s lost by the end of 1941 alone, huge numbers.
Small number.
But here's the crucial distinction. Even while their factories were being threatened, even overrun in some cases, Stalin's system prioritized sheer production over, let's say, refinement or crew comfort. They just kept building thousands more to replace the losses. They even simplified the design slightly at times, just to speed up the assembly line.
They value good enough and lots of it over perfect but few.
Precisely. And the sheer disparity in the final production numbers, looking at the whole war, is the definitive proof of why Germany was fighting a losing battle, really, regardless of their later improvements like the Tiger or the Panther.
Okay, let's put those final wartime production numbers into perspective for everyone listening. The USSR produced 53,552 T-34 tanks alone, just that one model family over the course of the war. 53,000.
It's staggering. And now, compare that to Germany's total wartime tank production of all types combined, everything from the little Panzer I right up to the Panzer IV, Panther Tiger, King Tiger, the whole lot.
What was the German total?
A mere 19,938. Less than 20,000 tanks of all types, compared to over 50,000 of just the T-34.
Wow. That puts it starkly. It wasn't just a failure to match the enemy's design initially, it was a devastating, unrecoverable failure of industrial capacity. Germany was fighting a crushing numerical disadvantage against a machine that was, in most key respects for that environment, functionally superior and engineered for the brutal realities of the Eastern Front.
Absolutely. So by the end of 1941, the German Wehrmacht knew. They knew they had encountered a truly superior machine, smartly designed, relentlessly manufactured. They realized they couldn't beat it in battle consistently, and they certainly couldn't match its production numbers.
Which logically, if perhaps desperately, led them to the next step in this whole story. If you can't build one that competes, well, maybe you steal one.
Yeah, that phrase, if you can't beat them, steal them. It really captures the sort of desperate pragmatism the Germans were forced into. Since the T-34 was so clearly superior to their own early war designs, like the Panzer III and early 40s,
They had to do something.
right, they decided to adopt captured units, integrate them into their own forces. And this wasn't just a random one-off thing happening here and there. Sources indicate that somewhere around 300 captured T-34s would ultimately fight under German colors. They even gave them an official designation. Panzerkampfwagen T-34 747 Arno. The R standing for Russisch, or Russian.
300 sounds like a decent number, maybe enough for a few battalions. On paper, this strategy seems sound. You capture a superior enemy tank, you patch it up, maybe paint a big German cross on it, and use it to plug gaps in your own lines or replace losses.
Makes perfect sense on paper. However, this is precisely where the illusion of just possessing the tank completely shattered against the brutal reality of logistics and maintenance. This is where the German mechanics, the guys on the ground trying to make this work, truly learned the bitter lesson of the Eastern Front.
Okay, let's get into the nuts and bolts of that failure. What was the core problem?
The central thesis of this whole logistical nightmare was articulated perfectly by a German officer named Burkhard Müller-Hillebrand. He basically stated, and I'm paraphrasing slightly, mere possession of a captured tank is not enough. It is useless unless continuous maintenance of the vehicles is possible, and this depends entirely on the availability of spare parts.
That statement sounds almost prophetic for the entire German war effort on the Eastern Front, doesn't it? Not just for captured tanks.
It really does. It's like the difference between finding a fancy abandoned sports car by the side of the road and actually being able to keep it running, right? You suddenly take an ownership of this highly complex machine,
Yep.
engineered by your enemy, probably with no manuals or manuals in a language you can't read.
Using systems and parts that are completely alien to your own established supply chain.
Exactly. So what were the immediate core logistical problems facing those German mechanics assigned to these captured T-34s?
Let's break them down.
Well, the first massive barrier was simply the incompatibility of industrial standards and tools. Germany, as you'd expect, relied on its own specific design standards, specific types of threading for bolts, specific dimensions for components.
Everything standardized for German production.
Right. The Soviets, on the other hand, used the metric system, yes, but often with their own unique specifications for things like screw threading, fasteners, tolerances, the exact dimensions of bearings or gears.
So not just metric versus imperial, but different flavors of metric almost.
Kind of. It meant that if a critical bolt sheared off on a T-34's engine or transmission, the German mechanics couldn't just grab a standard German metric bolt from their supply truck. It wouldn't fit correctly, the thread pitch might be off, the head size different.
A tiny difference that stops everything.
Precisely. A half-millimeter difference in a critical bore for a transmission casing might mean weeks of trying to improvise a fix or needing specialized machining tools they just didn't have in a field workshop.
So they weren't just trying to fix an unfamiliar tank with no manual. They were often trying to do it with literally the wrong wrenches, the wrong fasteners. This must have slowed repairs down to an absolute crawl, even for what should have been simple issues.
Absolutely. Think about the friction caused by something as basic as replacing a damaged track link or repairing a broken suspension bogie wheel. The Germans had specialized tools, pullers, presses, all calibrated perfectly for their panzers.
Made for the job.
To fix a T-34, the mechanics often found themselves having to basically fabricate custom repair tools on the fly. They were essentially manufacturing their own specialized equipment in a muddy field repair depot, all while under immense pressure to get their own German-made tanks back into the fight.
That sounds incredibly inefficient.
It was massively inefficient, and beyond just the incompatibility of standards and tools, the T-34 itself wasn't exactly known for being a paragon of flawless mechanical reliability, even when it was being serviced by its own Soviet crews who understood it.
Right. The sources highlight that T-34s were actually notoriously temperamental, often suffering specifically from pretty catastrophic and complex transmission issues.
That detail is absolutely crucial. When the Germans captured a T-34, it was rarely in perfect running order. It usually had some kind of battle damage, obviously, but very often it had pre-existing mechanical failures, particularly those notorious problems with the V2 diesel engine's transmission and clutch system.
Even the Soviets struggled with that.
Oh, yeah. Even the Soviets found the transmission difficult. It apparently required a huge amount of skill and sheer physical effort just to operate the gearshift levers, let alone maintain and repair the complex gearbox internals. So for German mechanics, working often under primitive field conditions, without the proper Soviet-designed jigs or specialized lifting equipment needed for these heavy Soviet components, repairing those complex transmission issues was borderline impossible sometimes.
Is there a specific example that highlights this difficulty?
Yes, there's a really telling case study from Kharkov in March 1943. The Waffen-SS Second Panzer Division, Das Reich, after retaking the city, managed to find approximately 50 damaged T-34s left behind by the Soviets.
50 tanks? That's a significant find.
It is. But they also had a massive, almost unique advantage in this situation.
Which was?
They had access to the actual Kharkov tractor plant facilities, the very factory, plant number 183, that had originally built many of those T-34s before being evacuated.
Wow. Okay, so they had the original factory, presumably with some leftover tools, maybe even some spare parts lying around. You'd assume, with that kind of advantage, they could achieve a near-perfect restoration rate on those 50 tanks.
That's what you'd think, right? The ideal scenario for captured equipment repair. Yet even with that huge advantage, The physical infrastructure, maybe some specialized tools, the heavy machinery needed for complex engine and transmission work, they could only restore 25 of those 50 tanks to operational status.
Only half. Inside the tank's own birthplace.
Exactly. A 50% success rate, even under what should have been the absolute best possible combat repair circumstances you could imagine, just shows how quickly that logistical and maintenance chain broke down when confronted with the reality of trying to support Soviet mass production designs with German methods and resources.
That really drives the point home. It proves this just wasn't a sustainable model for the Germans. So, okay, if they couldn't get reliable spare parts through any kind of organized German logistics system, what were the poor mechanics on the ground forced to do? How did they keep any of these running?
They basically had only two terrible options left for acquiring spare parts, and both of them really speak volumes about the sheer desperation of the late war German situation on the Eastern Front.
Okay, what was option one?
Option 1. Cannibalize parts from other destroyed or broken down T-34s. This often meant conducting really risky battlefield recovery operations, sometimes literally driving out under fire, just to scavenge a crucial transmission component, an engine part, or even just a single road wheel from a knocked-out wreck. They were essentially creating a supply line out of battlefield debris.
Extremely dangerous and inefficient. What was option two? It must have been even more of a long shot.
Option 2 is basically pure hope. Hope against all realistic probability that they might capture a specific Soviet supply depot or a train that just happened to contain the exact specialized parts they needed for the specific model year and variant of the T-34 they were trying to fix.
And that was complicated too, right? The T-34 wasn't just one standard model.
Not at all. The T-34 itself went through numerous modifications and production changes throughout the war, often to simplify manufacturing. So, a part from a 1941 T-34 model might not fit a 1943 model with the hexagonal turret, for example. They were constantly searching for these very specific needles in a vast, cold, chaotic Russian haystack.
I have to pause here for a second. This entire effort just sounds wildly, incredibly inefficient. Now, we know the German Wehrmacht struggled with logistics in general, especially on the Eastern Front with its vast distances. But wasn't using captured equipment a fairly standard practice in warfare? Did the Germans struggle this much with, say, captured American Shermans or British tanks on the Western Front? Why was the T-34 specifically such a logistical black hole for them?
That's a really crucial point to clarify.
Yeah.
Yes, capturing and reusing enemy equipment was absolutely standard practice for all armies. However, the scale and the specific nature of the T-34 problem on the Eastern Front made it unique for a couple of main reasons.
Yeah.
First, the sheer scale of their attempted commitment. Germany wasn't just using a few captured T-34s here and there. They actually tried to form and operate entire companies, even battalions sometimes, equipped solely with these tanks. Doing that on the Eastern Front, with its immense distances, terrible roads, and extreme weather, put far greater strain on maintenance than, say, operating a captured Sherman in France.
The operating environment was much harsher.
Much harsher. And second, the technical and industrial gulf was just too large. Western Allied equipment, while different, generally adhered to common logistical standards, or at least standards that were more familiar or closer to German specifications in terms of things like fasteners, electrical systems, etc. Plus, in the West, they were often operating closer to their own major logistical hubs in occupied France or Germany itself.
Whereas the T-34 was from a completely different industrial world.
Exactly. The T-34 represented this radical, purpose-built Soviet military-industrial system that was entirely isolated from and incompatible with the German standard in almost every important way. It wasn't just a different tank. It was a product of a different industrial philosophy.
So this fundamental inability to create and maintain a functioning supply chain for these captured tanks led directly to the rapid failure of the German project to integrate them effectively into their forces.
Precisely. German military reports from the time explicitly noted that these attempts to create standing captured tank companies were largely unsuccessful, and that these specialized units were often dissolved very soon after formation. Why? Because the tanks simply broke down constantly and could not be reliably sustained in the field. The initial excitement of capturing a superior enemy tank quickly faded into the continuous, grinding reality of mechanical failure and zero effective part support.
Which brings us then to perhaps the most damaging factor in this whole equation: the expertise problem. It wasn't just that they were lacking parts. They were diverting their absolute best, most skilled maintenance personnel, their expert mechanics, to fix enemy equipment that they ultimately couldn't sustain anyway.
And that's what one German officer aptly called an irrational expenditure of effort.
It truly sounds irrational when you put it like that.
It was. These captured T-34s required German mechanics to rapidly acquire specialized knowledge of Soviet metallurgy, Soviet engine design, Soviet electrical systems, Soviet transmission quirks, entirely new disciplines they had to try and learn quickly and effectively, often without proper training or documentation.
They were essentially having to become experts in Soviet engineering on the fly.
While fighting a war, they were forced to try and create special repair tools, train specific experts for these alien Soviet systems. And this highly skilled technical labor force was arguably the one resource that Germany, by 1943-44, could least afford to waste.
Because meanwhile, back in the German repair depots, what was happening?
Yeah. Standard German tanks, their own Panthers, Tigers, Panzer V, were piling up, damaged or broken down, waiting for service. These German machines, the actual core of their dwindling armored fighting force, were instead left waiting, sometimes for weeks, for the skilled labor that was currently tied up trying to breathe life back into some temperamental Soviet transmission that might only last another 50 kilometers before failing again.
That is the bitter, tangible irony these mechanics must have faced every single day. They'd spend weeks, maybe even months, pouring high-value time, effort, and scarce materials into getting a captured T-34 back to operational status.
Knowing, with almost complete certainty, that the very next breakdown might be the absolute last, because the specific replacement part they'd need simply did not exist anywhere behind German lines. They couldn't just order it.
They were holding this technically superior, feared enemy machine in their hands, but their entire military-industrial infrastructure was incapable of actually supporting it long-term.
Exactly. And it's this intimate, hands-on knowledge of their own military's deep logistical fragility, combined directly with a grudging technical admiration for the enemy's surprisingly effective machine, that really laid the profound psychological groundwork for the shift in thinking we see emerging later in the war.
Yeah.
The shift towards seeing the T-34 not as a trophy, but maybe as something else entirely.
So, by 1943-1944, these German mechanics found themselves in a really unique, almost privileged position. They had this intimate, hands-on, undeniable proof of Soviet technical effectiveness and industrial might right there in their workshops.
Every day, yeah.
And that was combined with the crushing awareness of their own military's deep logistical shortcomings, the collapsing supply lines, and the massive opportunity cost of their own skilled labor being spent on these captured tanks. This technical realism, born in the grease pits, became the engine driving the, perhaps surprising, logic of surrender.
Right. And the broader strategic context here is absolutely essential when we start talking about the logic of surrender. We're firmly in the 1943-1944 period now. This is when the strategic tide had well and truly irreversibly turned against the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front. It was a period defined by almost non-stop grinding retreat.
This is the direct aftermath of absolutely catastrophic, irreplaceable German losses. We're talking about the surrender of the entire 6th Army at Stalingrad in February 1943, a psychological and material blow from which the German army arguably never truly recovered.
A turning point, no question.
And then, the decisive loss at the Battle of Kursk in July 1943, the largest tank battle in history, which basically confirmed that Germany had lost the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front for good. The war was lost. It was really just a matter of how long it would take and how bloody the end would be.
Absolutely. So if you are one of these skilled German mechanics, maybe assigned to a special workshop, trying to keep a handful of captured T-34s running in, say, late 1943 or early 1944, you aren't really listening to the optimistic propaganda broadcasts coming out of Berlin anymore.
No, your reality is right in front of you.
Your reality is the brutal day-to-day technical evidence of Soviet superiority laid bare in the steel and oil you work with. Your worldview is being defined not by Nazi ideology, but by failing differential gears, constantly snapping track pins, worn-out engine bearings, and fuel gauges that always seem to be nearing empty.
This is the mechanic's personal, highly technical, unavoidable realization of defeat. They're constantly comparing the captured T-34 they're struggling to fix with the increasingly fragile German tanks they're often failing to sustain. Let's start digging into that comparison, maybe beginning with reliability.
Okay. The T-34's core engineering offered undeniable, tangible evidence right there in the workshop of why the German war effort was ultimately collapsing logistically. Take the engine, for example. The T-34 ran on a remarkably robust, relatively simple V2 diesel engine.
Okay, diesel and German tanks.
German tanks, like the much-vaunted Panther and the Tiger,
Hmm?
typically relied on complex, high-performance Maybach gasoline engines. This difference, diesel versus gasoline, was actually massive in the context of the Eastern Front.
What were the specific advantages of the T-34's diesel engine in that brutal environment?
Well, first, and maybe most critically, especially for crew safety and morale, diesel fuel is far less volatile, far less flammable than the high-octane gasoline used in German tanks.
Right, gasoline burns much more easily.
Much more easily. So if a T-34 took a penetrating hit to the engine compartment or fuel tanks, the diesel fuel was significantly less likely to immediately burst into flames and engulf the tank. This often gave the crew a crucial few seconds longer to bail out and survive. That difference dramatically affected the psychological calculus for the crews. Knowing your tank was less likely to become an instant inferno, that mattered.
Survival is always a very persuasive argument, isn't it?
Absolutely. Second key advantage, logistics. Diesel fuel was generally easier for the Soviet war economy, especially with Allied Lend-Lease support for refining capacity, to produce in mass quantities compared to the specific high-grade gasoline required for those sophisticated, high-compression German Maybach engines. Fuel supply was becoming a critical bottleneck for Germany.
And third, performance.
Third, performance characteristics. The diesel engine in the T-34 provided excellent torque, which is great for off-road performance, and generally offered better operational range per liter of fuel compared to the thirstier German gasoline engines. This was absolutely vital on the Eastern Front, with its vast distances, poor road networks, and crumbling German supply lines. Range mattered immensely.
Okay, so the T-34's engine was safer, logistically easier, and more efficient. What about the high-tech German machines that these mechanics were also supposed to be keeping in the fight? How were they holding up by comparison?
The contrast becomes really stark by 1943-44. Our sources note that the German Panther, remember, the Panther was conceived as Germany's direct answer to the T-34, incorporating sloped armor, often suffered from severe mechanical reliability issues.
Especially early on, right?
Especially early on. But problems persisted. Particularly notorious were failures in their final drives and transmission systems. These were complex, highly stressed components that just weren't robust enough initially. Some reports suggest many early Panthers suffered major breakdowns after less than 1,500 kilometers of combat driving, sometimes much less. Many never even made it to the battle lines due to mechanical failures, not due to enemy action.
That's damning. And you mentioned fuel efficiency was a killer.
It was becoming a terminal problem for the German war effort. The Panther, due to its heavy weight and powerful but thirsty gasoline engine, required almost twice as much fuel as a T-34 to cover the same distance. Think about that.
Twice the fuel.
In a war theater, increasingly defined by constant retreat, completely broken supply lines stretching hundreds of kilometers back, and chronic, crippling fuel shortages across the entire Wehrmacht. A machine that uses half the fuel and is inherently more reliable becomes a powerful, undeniable symbol. It represents competence, pragmatism, and sustainability versus Germany's increasingly over-engineered, logistically unsustainable complexity.
So you paint a picture of these mechanics as highly skilled realists. They're seeing the writing on the wall, not based on battlefield reports necessarily, but based on these undeniable technical facts right in front of them every day.
Exactly.
Soviet tanks are simpler to fix, if you add the parts. More reliable overall, much more fuel efficient, and crucially, they're being built and fielded in overwhelming, seemingly endless numbers. Meanwhile, your own side's sophisticated tanks are constantly breaking down. They're incredibly hard to fix. They drink all the precious fuel you don't have. It seems inevitable that survival logic starts to override ideological loyalty or duty.
They see the Soviets have tens of thousands of T-34s rolling off the lines. Germany has maybe, 300 captured units in total across the entire front, most of which are probably broken down in depots somewhere waiting for non-existent spare parts. The Soviet industrial machine, evacuated safely behind the Urals, is just advancing relentlessly. For the mechanics working hands-on, the T-34 isn't just winning battles, it's clearly won the factory war, the production war.
But there's another fascinating layer of tactical complexity here too, isn't there? It wasn't just about maintenance. Even if the German mechanics managed to get a T-34 running perfectly and a German crew took it into combat, the tank itself was designed around a different operational doctrine, a different crew layout, which actually put the German crews at a severe disadvantage compared to being in their own panzers. This is the tactical paradox you mentioned.
Yes, this is a really interesting detail that Müller-Hillebrand, the German officer we mentioned earlier, also pointed out. He observed that even when German units successfully employed captured T-34s in combat, they were often tactically inferior to their own panzers in a firefight. Not because of the tank's hardware, but specifically because of the two-man turret crew arrangement designed into the T-34.
Okay, let's break down that difference in turret crew again, because it seems really counterintuitive that the better tank could be tactically worse when used by Germans. How did the turret crews differ?
German tank design, reflecting German military doctrine's strong emphasis on command, control, and situational awareness, almost universally utilized a three-man turret crew, certainly in their main battle tanks like the Panzer IV and later the Panther and Tiger.
And those roles were?
You had the tank commander, the gunner, and the loader. This clear division of labor was critical. It allowed the commander to dedicate his entire focus to maintaining situational awareness, scanning the battlefield through his cupola, identifying threats and targets, directing the driver, coordinating with other tanks in the unit via radio, and making tactical decisions. He wasn't distracted by also having to aim and fire the main gun.
Okay, clear roles. How did the T-34 differ?
The T-34, conversely, prioritized design simplicity and speed of production. This led its designers to opt for a smaller two-man turret crew in the main T-34-76 models that the Germans captured early on. This turned out to be a major operational weakness, especially when compared to the German system.
So who was in the T-34 turret?
You had the loader, and then you had the commander, who also had to act as the gunner.
Ah, so the commander was doing two jobs at once.
Exactly. And that's the fatal flaw from a German tactical perspective. The moment the T-34 commander spotted a target and decided to engage it, he had to drop down, put his eye to the gun sight, traverse the turret, aim, and fire the gun. During that entire process, his focus was completely diverted from the overall battlefield. He instantly lost his wider situational awareness.
He couldn't see what else was happening outside?
Precisely. He couldn't effectively direct the driver, couldn't easily communicate with the rest of his platoon, couldn't spot new threats emerging from the flanks, because his head was effectively down, focused entirely on the gun sight and the firing mechanism.
In the absolute chaos of a fluid tank battle, losing that situational awareness, even for just 5 or 10 seconds while engaging a target, could be absolutely fatal, couldn't it? You might miss the next tank aiming at you.
It's a devastating tactical weakness, especially for a crew trained in the German methods of coordinated maneuver and precise commander-led fire control. It essentially meant that even though you might be sitting in a tank with superior armor and mobility, the T-34, you couldn't actually utilize those advantages effectively because your internal command structure, the way the crew functioned, was fundamentally flawed compared to the German tactical doctrine they were trained in. German crews and captured T-34s simply couldn't fight like German crews were supposed to fight.
And this presumably forced the German crews using T-34s to try and adapt to Soviet-style tactics, which were perhaps based more on volume of fire and aggression rather than precise command and control.
That seems to be the implication. Müller-Hillebrand himself noted, somewhat dismissively perhaps, that Soviet T-34 attacks often resembled charges like a herd of wild bulls, where they just continuously fired their guns while driving forward, obviously without aiming precisely. They prioritized overwhelming aggression and shock effect over finesse.
So a German crew, trained for precision, coordination, and commander-led tactics, was forced into this unfamiliar, confusing, and ultimately less effective fighting style when they were put inside a captured T-34.
It seems so. They couldn't achieve the high level of focused fire control and coordinated maneuver they were used to in their panzers. It must have just compounded the overall sense of operational failure and frustration. Not only was the logistical chain completely broken, but the machine itself, even when working, forced them to fight in a way that was alien and probably felt much less safe and effective to them.
Okay, so now we can really start to synthesize all these elements. The backdrop of inevitable strategic defeat by 1944, the stark technical realism provided by the daily maintenance struggles and comparisons, and this added layer of tactical paradox and frustration. It all seems to point towards the final, perhaps grimly logical step: surrender. And why the captured T-34 became, in this narrative, the ultimate vehicle for that calculated surrender.
Exactly.
Yep.
By 1944, for many soldiers trapped on the collapsing Eastern Front, survival had become the paramount concern, overriding almost everything else. The war was clearly lost. Why die needlessly for a losing cause? In that context, the captured T-34 transforms from a problematic asset into something else.
An escape vehicle.
An escape vehicle, yes.
Yeah.
But the choice to surrender specifically in an operational T-34, rather than just walking out with a white flag or trying to surrender in a broken-down German Panzer, seems to be an act of very specific, pragmatic calculation. driven by all the technical and tactical realities these mechanics and crews intimately understood.
Okay, let's spell out that calculation. Why surrender in a T-34? What were the perceived advantages?
Well, the first reason is perhaps the most obvious, a matter of immediate tactical survival during the act of surrendering itself.
Hmm.
It's a Soviet tank.
Right. Your own side might shoot at you, but the enemy might hesitate.
Correct. The thinking, presumably, was that approaching Soviet forces might hesitate for just a crucial moment before opening fire, if they saw a vehicle they recognized as their own, rolling towards them, maybe with a white flag flying. That tiny split second of hesitation, of recognition and confusion, could be the difference between being captured relatively safely and being instantly annihilated by anti-tank guns or other tanks.
A small chance, but maybe better than none. What's the second reason?
Secondly, it acts as a kind of nonverbal message to their potential captors. Surrendering in a T-34 subtly shows a degree of respect for Soviet engineering and, by extension, Soviet industrial might.
How so?
It implies something like, look, we know your machine is good, we bothered to fix it up, we understand its capabilities, we acknowledge its superiority in a way. It suggests the surrendering crew isn't just blindly following orders, they understand the technical reality of the situation.
Okay, a subtle sign of respect.
Thirdly, and related to that, it demonstrates absolute realism. The crew is openly, physically acknowledging who is winning the war by literally driving up in the enemy's most successful and iconic weapon system.
No room for doubt there.
Exactly. It signals to the Soviets that these are not fanatical Nazi ideologues committed to a hopeless fight to the death in their own German tank. Instead, they are perhaps skilled technical personnel, maybe mechanics, maybe a trained crew, a valuable prize in themselves who are also pragmatists. They're ready to cease hostilities based on the overwhelming mechanical and strategic evidence of defeat.
And that leads logically to the fourth and perhaps most deeply pragmatic point. The hope or belief that this specific act, surrendering in their tank, handing over an operational high-value piece of enemy equipment, might actually buy the surrendering crew better treatment from the Soviet forces.
It's essentially peace offering, isn't it? A tangible, valuable gift. Here's your tank back, fully operational, demonstrating our skill and our lack of fanaticism. Please treat us accordingly. For the German mechanic who might have spent weeks nursing this difficult beast back to life, wrestling with its fragile transmission and using incompatible tools,
The T-34 stops being an enemy trophy or just a logistical burden.
it becomes something entirely different. It becomes a lifeboat, a symbol perhaps of their own hard-earned technical knowledge paradoxically applied to an enemy machine, and ultimately a potential means to escape the impossible, unwinnable odds stacking up against them on the Eastern Front. This entire narrative, whether entirely factual or a potent myth, speaks volumes about the complete collapse of German morale and the drastically changing priorities of many late-war German soldiers when faced with annihilation. Survival trumped all.
You know, the story of these mechanics potentially wanting to surrender in the T-34 is so powerful because it doesn't just highlight a single moment of defeat or desperation. It really underscores the T-34's massive, arguably world-altering historical impact. This was the tank that forced Germany, a nation utterly obsessed with its own perceived technological superiority, to completely abandon its established armored doctrine and innovate purely in reaction to what the enemy had fielded.
Absolutely. The T-34 was the undeniable catalyst, the shock that forced the development of Germany's most famous late-war tank designs. The Panther tank, for instance, introduced in 1943, is a direct and very visible response to the T-34.
You can literally see the influence, can't you?
You can see the force learning immediately, most obviously in the Panther's adoption of sloped frontal armor. That feature was essentially reverse-engineered, almost copied directly from the Soviet T-34 design principles. They were desperately trying to replicate the T-34's ballistic protection advantage.
And the other famous German beast, the massive Tiger tank, how did that fit in as a response?
The Tiger, which actually came slightly before the Panther, was another kind of answer to the T-34's devastating effectiveness. But instead of focusing on replicating the T-34's balanced design and sloped armor efficiency, the Tiger represented Germany choosing a different path, trying to achieve superiority through sheer brute force.
How so?
By providing absolutely massive gun power with its 88mm cannon, capable of destroying a T-34 at very long ranges, and combining that with immensely thick, though still mostly flat, armor plating. It was Germany essentially doubling down on complexity, firepower, and heavy protection, rather than embracing the T-34's philosophy of balanced design, simplicity, and mass production potential.
And that comparison right there, the complex, expensive, hard-to-build Panther and Tiger versus the relatively simple, mass-produced T-34, that's where the ultimate strategic failure for Germany lies, isn't it?
It really is. The core problem wasn't that Germany couldn't eventually design a powerful technical response to the T-34. They clearly could, and did, build highly complex tanks that were, in certain one-on-one matchups, arguably superior to the T-34, especially later models like the Tiger II. But the problem was, as always on the Eastern Front, industrial capacity and mechanical reliability. Germany simply could not build enough of these complex Panthers and Tigers to make a strategic difference, and they often struggled to keep the ones they did build running reliably in the field.
Even with Albert Speer's efforts later in the war to rationalize and streamline German production, they just couldn't match the sheer Soviet output of T-34s.
No, nowhere close. And this was a fundamental strategic failure exacerbated by Stalin's decision early in the war to evacuate entire tank factories, lock, stock, and barrel, east of the Ural Mountains, places like Tankograd and Chelyabinsk.
Putting them completely beyond the reach of German bombers or ground forces.
Exactly. It meant the Soviet T-34 production line was effectively invulnerable to direct German attack for most of the war. And those factories just kept churning out T-34s relentlessly, thousands upon thousands.
The Soviet Union had essentially built this engine of unstoppable, high-volume tank production that Germany could never shut down, nor could they ever really emulate with their own industrial philosophy, which tended towards more complex, high-quality, but low-volume output.
Precisely. Germany found itself constantly playing catch-up, pouring incredibly high-value resources, skilled labor, specialized materials, fuel into a relatively low-volume production line of sophisticated Panthers and Tigers, while the Soviet Union just kept burying them under sheer numbers of simpler, but crucially good enough, reliable T-34s. Quantity has a quality all its own, especially in total war.
It's also fascinating, looking back, how quickly the appearance of the T-34 forced such a complete U-turn in the official German attitude, moving rapidly away from that initial Nazi propaganda that dismissed all Soviet technology as inherently primitive, clunky, and inferior.
Oh, the sources absolutely confirm that rapid shift. From outright dismissal and arrogance in mid-1941 to grudging, then open admiration by 1942. German generals, the guys actually facing these things, started openly praising the T-34's design, recognizing its clear technical merits.
You mentioned General Friesner earlier.
Yes, General Johannes Friesner, for instance, was quoted specifically noting the T-34's remarkable reliability on any terrain. He observed pointedly that these Russian tanks could operate effectively in mud and snow, where German commanders thought it impossible for tanks to go. This wasn't just battlefield chatter anymore. This was formal recognition filtering up from the highest echelons of the German military command. They knew they'd underestimated the enemy profoundly.
And the fascination even went right to the very top, didn't it? Which seems almost unbelievable given Hitler's often rigid, sometimes non-technical, and highly ideological views on military technology and racial superiority.
Yes, incredibly. Even Hitler himself reportedly became quite intrigued, almost obsessed, by the T-34. Sources suggest he studied captured examples, personally inspected their internal mechanisms, and would apparently lecture his generals and engineers on their technical features, particularly that revolutionary sloped armor. The T-34 became this unavoidable object lesson in successful armored warfare design, delivered not by Germany's own engineers, but by the supposedly inferior enemy.
That forced realization of the enemy's technical superiority, coupled with their overwhelming numbers, really cemented the T-34's legacy far, far beyond just the Second World War, didn't it?
Oh, absolutely. We're talking about a truly global impact and a service longevity that very few military machines in history have ever achieved. The T-34 is genuinely iconic, one of the handful of weapon systems recognizable almost anywhere in the world.
And the production numbers back that up. You said it was the second most produced tank of all time.
That's right, with a truly astounding final tally of around 84,070 units built in total across all variants, including post-war production. It utterly dominated global armored warfare landscapes for decades after 1945.
And its service history is just unparalleled. It demonstrates the inherent soundness of its fundamental design concept. The T-34 didn't just help win World War II for the Allies. It continued to fight in major conflicts all over the world.
Korea, Vietnam, numerous Middle Eastern wars between Arab nations and Israel, proxy conflicts in Africa and Asia. Its combat record spans decades, well into the 1990s in some cases, like the Balkan Wars.
And incredibly, some smaller armies or reserve forces reportedly still operate upgraded T-34 variants today, maybe as training vehicles or light fire support platforms. That's over 80 years since its introduction.
That longevity is the ultimate testament to the genius of its core design philosophy. The T-34 introduced, or at least popularized and proved in combat, principles that became standard for main battle tanks globally for decades afterward. Like the effective use of sloped armor for ballistic protection. Like the widespread adoption of robust, reliable diesel engines for better fuel economy, range, and crew safety compared to gasoline. And perhaps most importantly, a fundamental design philosophy that emphasized a balance of mobility, protection, and firepower, combined with suitability for mass production, prioritizing reliability and manufacturability over excessive complexity, or achieving the absolute maximum performance in any single category.
The T-34 essentially proved, in the crucible of the Eastern Front, that in modern total warfare, the ability to rapidly and reliably manufacture a numerically superior weapon often outweighs the marginal advantage of having a technically complex, perhaps slightly superior on paper, but logistically fragile and hard-to-produce masterpiece like the German Tiger.
Precisely. It was the triumph of pragmatic, mass-produced effectiveness over costly, unsustainable technological perfectionism. Which brings us back full circle, doesn't it, to our German mechanic sweating over a captured T-34 gearbox in 1944. What was he truly fixing in that moment?
It feels like more than just a tank.
When that German mechanic spent all those hours, all that skill, rebuilding that captured Soviet machine, he was engaging in something profound, almost a philosophical act of confrontation with reality.
He wasn't just fixing a broken gearbox, was he? He was handling, piece by painful piece, the cold, hard, greasy evidence of his own side losing the industrial war, the logistical war, the production war. He was working intimately with a machine that represented the inevitable future of armored warfare, a future based on mass and efficiency, a future his own side, with its different priorities, was demonstrably unable to match or counter effectively.
You could almost say he wasn't just fixing a tank. He was physically acknowledging the enemy's victory in the realms of engineering pragmatism, logistical resilience, and sheer industrial production capacity. That operational rebuilt T-34 sitting there ready to run wasn't a trophy anymore. It was a heavy, tangible, rolling confession of impending defeat. And maybe, just maybe, the perfect vessel for a calculated, pragmatic surrender.
And that stark reality is what makes the surrender story, whether it happened frequently or was just a powerful rumor, so utterly compelling. It distills the essence of the late war on the Eastern Front. Highly skilled technicians, trained in precision, recognizing superior enemy engineering and overwhelming industrial might, and potentially letting go of a collapsing ideology in favor of technical realism and sheer self-preservation.
Exactly. Whether that specific surrender plan, fixing up a T-34 to hand it over, was a common occurrence, or perhaps just a pervasive rumor or myth that perfectly crystallized the widespread feelings of hopelessness and pragmatic realism spreading through the German ranks on the collapsing Eastern Front. Either way, it speaks to a much deeper truth, which is that by 1944, many German soldiers, especially the technically trained ones, were realists. They knew from first-hand experience that they were fighting with increasingly inadequate, unreliable, and outnumbered equipment against an enemy who was not only overwhelming them numerically, but was also fielding weapons, like the T-34, that were often technically superior in the ways that mattered most in that specific, brutal conflict.
The T-34 became more than just steel and tracks and an engine. It became a symbol of the Soviet Union's brutal determination, its resilience, and its underestimated industrial capacity to prevail, regardless of staggering initial losses. It was, in essence, simplicity, scaled up to overwhelm complexity.
And, this leaves us with a really provocative thought, doesn't it? One that extends far beyond just World War II and the Eastern Front. We saw the T-34 representing efficiency, simplicity, and overwhelming mass production, forcing Germany to ultimately abandon its complex, high-technology, low-volume tank doctrine. The Tiger, while formidable, was strategically unsustainable.
So the question becomes,
What modern conflict, or maybe even what modern industry today, is seeing a similar struggle play out? Where is overwhelming quantity and relative simplicity potentially winning out, or posing a serious challenge to highly sophisticated, extremely high cost, and perhaps logistically unsustainable quality or technological complexity?
That's a fascinating question. The tension between sophisticated, expensive, best versus numerous, cheap, good enough.
It's the fundamental challenge the T-34's legacy still presents, I think, to every military procurement officer, every industrial strategist, maybe even every tech CEO today. What's the right balance? And what's the true cost of complexity when faced with an adversary who masters mass and simplicity?
A profound concept to definitely consider, the potentially fatal cost of complexity in a world that is often defined by the need for scale, mass, and efficiency. Thank you. Thank you for diving deep into the mechanics, the psychology, and the absolute brutal reality of that pivotal machine and moment on the Eastern Front.
It's always a pleasure to unpack the true weight and the surprising lessons hidden within military history. There's always more beneath the surface.